I mean, just before we get started and I bring some people in for questions, you've played in many an autumn November international, although including, of course, we kick off on the last weekend of October. But what are your fondest memories? Any particular games stand out?
Yeah, many game, Nick, to be brutally honest. I think for me, again, not going back, we're in our 17 years, but I actually made my test debut against the then world champions England at the home of rugby, Twickenham, in the autumn. And as a 21-year-old, getting to represent your country, getting to travel, and experience a phenomenal, authentic rugby ground with incredible support, and the bellowing of Swing Low was pretty special. It was unfortunately very much dampened by the fact that we got absolutely pumped against a pretty strong England team. And even though I did score a try with my first touch of the ball in international rugby, just proud to have experienced the honor and privilege it is to represent your country. To do it up north in the autumn, was very cold. So much so that I had to be pulled back before running on as a reserve for the team manager to tell me that I'm still going to be replacing Brayton Paulson, but that I need to take the beanie off my head before I actually run onto the field.
Excellent. Yeah, minor detail. Good. Well, we'll open the floor to questions in just a sec. I mean, just one more from me before I do. South Africa will obviously open their Autumn Nation Series campaign against Wales. The Springboks, I guess they took a bit of flack for their playing style in the British and Irish Lions series. They finished third in the Rugby Championship, but that win against the All Blacks spoke volumes about their heart, didn't it? And then, going in and playing Wales, Scotland and England. I mean, it's a hell of a year for the Boks, isn't it?
It is one heck of a year. And I think, when you wear the mantle of, the Rugby World Cup champion tag, and, there were a lot of questions asked during the Lions series, but I think the manner in which the Springboks sort of came out of the rugby wilderness for the better part of, 2 years almost. The last game they played was against England in that Rugby World Cup final, to then have Super Rugby cancelled, have a local competition, run 5 times parallel ahead of the Lions series, to have COVID cases. And I think the manner in which the Springboks, came out of that tour, and yes, there was a lot of potential off-field stuff, but I think, the mental resilience that team showed, with everything going on was paramount. Obviously going over to Australasia and, facing some real thorough opposition. We had international exposure, for the better part of the last year. They sort of got found wanting against Australia, where again they were unlucky to lose the first game in the last minute by a spectacular Quade Cooper kick, and then sort of heavily beaten in the second test, and then met the All Blacks in that first one, which again lost in the last movement of the game, but proved in that last game that they are worthy World Cup champions. They have been through a lot together as a team, and I think as a South African, I think we really saw the test quality of the Springboks in that last game against the All Blacks. They will be heavily tested though against a Welsh, Scotland and England side that are looking to cement their place as the top tier nations within the Northern Hemisphere. So a lovely challenge, and how better to kick it all off with the Autumn Nations series and the launch of a new campaign.
To start you with a bit of a random one. I don't know if you've seen this morning, but Quinton de Kock pulled out of the South African cricket team to play in the T20 World Cup. It appears he didn't want to take the knee after Cricket South Africa ordered all the team to make that gesture. I just wondered what your position was on taking a knee in terms of anti-racism, and do you think players should be compelled to do it, or should it be a personal choice?
Yeah, Julian, I'm not quite sure this is the forum to be talking about that. I haven't seen the news around Quinton de Kock. Obviously, the talk around racism and the impact that he's had is something that has been, globally expressed over the better part, of the last year and a half, particularly, post, the incident with Floyd over in the United States. I think, many federations around the world have taken their stance. I think many players have felt entitled to take their own stance. I think, I'll be vocal about equality. But again, I'm not here to judge people on their own individual choices. So, I think for me, it's about being a voice. I think for many people, like the likes of a Stick Elisi, a Market Rashford, a Mario Toji, they've used their platform appropriately. To be honest, I don't know what I would do in that situation. I have not been asked to put myself in that situation, but, I really take my cap off to how people address it in their own unique way.
Thank you. And just one more from me on a rugby point of view. What do you think we can expect from the Springboks this autumn? As you say, they've had a heck of a tough schedule already, and now they've got these 3 tests, sort of in close proximity at the back end of this year. What are you looking for from them, and what do you think we can expect?
Julian, the Springboks haven't travelled up north for the last 2 years. They obviously had, or last 3 years to be clear. They last played against England in that Rugby World Cup final, and even though they played against the Lions earlier in this year, I think, and I said to Nick, as world champions, I think the expectations and standards that they set as a group are really high. Jacques Nienaber and Siya Kolisi, I think they're over in Paris at the moment, the team as a collective in preparation for next weekend against the Welsh. I think they would be looking to hopefully continue the form in which they sort of finished that last game against New Zealand. Coming up against some really stern opposition up north to test their mettle in a very different way. I think Jacques Nienaber's got a fine balancing act now in terms of using some of that experience that has garnered many a title and success over the last 2-3 years, but also expose a new group of young Springboks into that fold. So it's going to be a balancing act. I know Jacques is very big on winning, and he puts that paramount to everything else. So taking what they did in that last game, they would have been bitterly disappointed with the general consensus of the Rugby Championship and how they fared in the first 3 games. They would have felt they're unlucky, but again, in terms of weather conditions and what they're going to be expecting up north, I'm assuming that last game against the All Blacks would sort of be exactly the manner in which they would want to record victories. I know there would definitely be a 3-from-3 goal in place, and they would be focusing on that first game next week against Wales, where the Springboks haven't had much success, over the better part of the last half a decade.
Thank you.
Good. I just wondered, interesting to hear your, when you made your debut in the autumn, and so you're used to coming up here this time of year. I just wonder, how do you see these autumn periods in the future? What would you think would be the ideal format for them? Are you a sort of fan of the traditional tour, or are you more a fan of a competition? You've got to go to Murrayfield maybe to qualify to get up to a bigger game in Cardiff the following week. I don't know. How would you see it?
Rob, I think firstly, rugby definitely has evolved since I made my debut back in 2004. I think, player welfare has become one of the biggest talking points globally at the moment. You also look at the global calendar and how things are happening, and people are looking at ways of maybe structuring a little bit differently. I was extremely fortunate to be a part of the Autumn Nations Cup that happened in November last year, and that was brutally exciting, which culminated in what I believe was a fantastic final where a very young French side almost did the unpredictable and caused a major upset, and it just added a little bit more spice. We unfortunately didn't see the Fijian superpowers and superstars for the better part of that Autumn Nations Cup because of the COVID-related cases. But I think it did just bring in an added sense of excitement and an added sense of engagement for those watching at home on screen, and those lucky 2,000 that got to come to England to Twickenham for that final game. So I'm not quite sure where it goes. I think, the Autumn Nations series, as it has now been relaunched, in terms of trying to create a different feeling towards that, does it build up towards a final? Does it build up to a potential winner? To really just bring that pragmatism around the manner in which teams compete. So last year was really great for me. I think if player welfare does afford it, I think it would be great to see a culmination of sorts. 20 games across the autumn is exciting. I think what really has been nice to see in terms of the relaunch of the Autumn Nation series is the fact that the 20 games aren't sort of overlapping each other, which was a major part of the past 2 or 3 decades, to be brutally honest. So I think for fans being able to be engaged and watch games throughout the course of the day, supporting the various teams, I think is a really niche product offering, which will hopefully get as many involved and potentially attract some new rugby fans to the game, not only on the field but off it as well.
Yeah, no, sure. And so, I mean, combining that July and that November windows, in some form, somehow, in a more coherent package is the way forward then. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that would be great. And I think that is much of the talk going around with regards to the global calendar, to look sort of not to create the World Cup every year, but to create a lot more competitiveness in sort of getting towards a winner of a competition, and sort of combining those two, because I think the biggest debate globally at the moment is the fact that rugby is a winter sport, and winter in the northern hemisphere and winter in the southern hemisphere is always at a different time. But in June, it's sort of the end of the northern hemisphere season. In November, December, it's sort of the end of the southern hemisphere season. So trying to mar and get a better correlation between those two. Again, having player welfare, paramount to the end result. So I think it's an exciting time. I think the Autumn Nation series and its launch, in trying to create a little bit more excitement, not only with the new logo, but different manners in which they're engaging with the fans. I think is really important. And when you have 8 of some of the best teams in the world, competing across 20 games, it really does add that little bit more in terms of a viewer spectacle.
Cool. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Maybe if we could just look at your first opponent, South Africa, in terms of Wales next weekend. Obviously, Wales this weekend can't field a certain number of their players, but they'll all be back. The likes of Louis Rees-Zammit in role position as well. What are you expecting for that South African opener down in South Wales?
Yeah, so I mean, Russ, if we go back over the last 4 or 5 years, the titanic battles between the Welsh and the South Africans, it has been one that has been physically won up front, and I can't see this game being much different. Having played at the Principality Stadium under the roof, it's one of the best stadiums to play rugby in, and I think for many of these South African boys, they would have played there, but there might be 1 or 2 youngsters who get to experience it for the first time, and hopefully what we took from that World Cup final, and what was potentially a very kicking orientated game, but a game that was really physically cumbersome for both teams. But there is some talented, fast-paced people in the back line, which I'm hoping the likes of a Louis Rees-Zammit coming up against a Makazole Mapimpi comes to the fore. Willie Leroux has played over at the Principality for a number of years now. So hopefully the dry roof, or the closed roof for a dry circumstance, makes for some exciting running rugby. And it's always a nail biter. I know that Wales definitely have had the upper hand, unfortunately, from a South African perspective, over the better part of the last 6 or 7 years at the Principality. And Jacques Nienaber will know that over the next 10 days leading up to next week Saturday, the preparation after the team really got, I think, a good 2 weeks off post. I think it was 18 weeks in a bio bubble of sort. Will have refreshed them, and they'll be raring to go come kick off next week Saturday.
And Brian, it'd be rude not to maybe quickly mention England as well as the final opponent for South Africa. We all know what happened in the Rugby World Cup final and so on, but England finally, as I'm sure you've seen, making a few squad changes, 1 or 2 veteran stalwarts given a tournament off to reprove their worth, and the likes of Marcus Smith into the squad, exciting young players. What do you think about Eddie Jones's eventual decision to do that, and what might we see, I wonder?
Yeah. So I think Eddie, I don't think he was under pressure. I think Eddie never really feels the pressure coming from outside, but I think Eddie is a bit of a visionary when it comes to the rugby environment. One of the most tactical prowess brains that I've ever worked with. That going back to 2007, and the fine details he put in place is potentially what we saw when he took over the England Raisins and won 17 in a row. I think in this mid-World Cup cycle, he now knows that he potentially needs an opportunity to blood young, new environment within that squad setup. And, the likes of a Marcus Smith has had a dream 12 months, to be brutally honest, and justly rewarded, along with many others. Look at the Dom Brons of the world, who, again, was instrumental in where Quins ended up, winning in the manner in which they did the Premiership last season. So, that mixed with a couple of old heads, and, you think they're not pressure on someone like Owen Farrell, just to provide a lot of leadership, a lot of tutelage to new ones coming into the setup, but, being able to help those literally grasp the opportunity with both hands. So, I think it has been a bit of a masterstroke by Eddie in a potential series where he can give opportunities to sort of mix that, experience with youth, and hopefully in so doing, get a better insight into what he really needs to look forward to for, the World Cup in France in 2023, because he now only has 2 years to go. So, yeah, I think it's going to be great, and it's going to test all opposition players, who come over to Twickenham and try beat the English, because it's going to come on the top of some players playing some really great rugby and coming together in a squad that wants to do their nation proud and not revenge what happened in 2019, but really prove their worth